So as you all probably know, I've been using the pages router for my side projects with next.js for a long time now. And slowly I've been trying to transition to learn more about the app router just to kind of get a better feel for it and see if I even like the approaches of it. So far, I kind of like it a lot. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to use the Pokemon API just to kind of introduce some concepts to anyone who might be new to the app router or React server components or server actions. And hopefully you guys can learn something. So with the app directory slash app router, every directory is basically the path in your project, right? So starting at the base path here, this is just like the base root level of the app folder. So if I were to make another folder here called like, testing, and I were to put a page.tsx in there, this basically is the route slash testing, which will invoke this page and start using some of the content. So if I were to go ahead and just do this code here and type in like testing and do this. So make sure you have an export default, but whatever function you export, next app router is going to look for this page file, and then it uses that to basically render out the route. So let's just type in testing, and you will see that it prints out testing here, right? So the router is pretty simple. And it's similar to like the pages directory where if you needed to have like dynamic data, so for example, if I need to get an ID here, you would make an ID, and I could just put a page file here. And to get that ID, I believe you can actually just print out these params real quick. Let's just see what happens if we do this. So I will go to testing/123, and that prints out params of ID 123. So this is how you can get access to those params there. So if you wanted to, for example, just print out like, I don't know, params ID, I got the wrap that in curly braces maybe. Let's see what happens. Okay, so now you see it prints out testing 123. It basically took the ID that was in the URL, because we defined that with brackets ID. So this is like very similar to the pages directory. And those are just going to be passed in directly right here. You can also get query string parameters. So if I were to console log, I think it's path params maybe. I don't even know at this point. Let's just go ahead and say like testing hello equals world. Okay. So if you want to get access to the query string, let's just print this out real quick. And let's see what the structure is. One thing I'm still trying to figure out is how do you type these things? Like you'd think that there'd be a type you can apply to your function in TypeScript so that you get this typed already. For some reason, I couldn't find it. So leave a comment if you know what that is. But you'll see here you get a search params and a params. So technically you could do this, and you could say search params that, and we can just go ahead and print out what hello is. All right, so notice it prints out 123. That's coming from the URL, and then the question mark hello equals world. We have a query string, which allows us to get the search parameters of the key hello and the value of world. So those are like some of the most basic things you need to know about the router and how this stuff works. I want to kind of talk about the layout a little bit. So often in a web application, you need like header, you might need like a side navigation bar and stuff like that. What you can do is you can make a file called layout. In fact, this one already has one. And in the layout, what you can do is you can define like a header or a side nav, and this is where it's going to render out any nested subroute. So for example, if we were to go to this testing route here, that's going to take the content of this page and basically put it here inside the children, because the layout is at the top level directory. Does that make sense? Just to make sure this point kind of makes sense, let's just go ahead and put a header here. I'll just say like div. It could be a class of, I don't know, blue, height of 40, and that's probably good. Let's just see if that renders something. So I'm zoomed in a lot, so that's why it looks giant, but we got a header here. Obviously it's a little too big, so let's make it a little smaller. So the black area down here below, this is what's being inserted inside of the children here. Okay, and the cool thing about the layout is every nested subroute, you can make another layout. So I can say layout TSX. And I'm going to go ahead and just copy over this layout. I don't think the metadata is that important right now, but I guess you can export metadata on the layout if you wanted to kind of like overwrite your HTML metadata in the head, in the headers or whatever, but we don't really care too much about that. So let's just go ahead and make like another layout. This will be called like a sive nav layout. And in this particular instance, we don't need like HTML body because that's already defined at a higher level layout. what we could do instead is we could probably do like an aside here, and then we could just do some children over here. So if you wanted to like have a side navigation exist on every page that was nested inside of testing, maybe it would make more sense to call this a dashboard. Like, you know how you have like a dashboard page and usually your dashboard has a bunch of like side nav with commands. You can do that. So I'll just go ahead and say like ABC, B, C, D, and then we will style this a little bit. Let's just give this a BG of red, and I'll give this a width of 20. Hopefully that'll help drive the point home. And of course, we need to wrap this in a fragment because we're trying to render out children here. So are y'all confused yet? What this is doing is it's nesting basically all of the sub routes. For example, we're doing ID and page. That's going to nest the content of that sub route inside of the children here. Okay, so we should see, hopefully, if we go back to testing, if we go back to like dashboard 1, 2, 3, we should see a side nav, we should see a header, and then we should see the actual content in the middle here. So what we could actually do here is say height of screen, height of screen. That should make it full height. And if I were to do this right, I don't think I need to style this. Let's give this a wrapper that has a flex. So if you go to like the actual docs in Next, like I think they have really good diagrams that show you like the tree structure. So like you have a layout up here like this. And then when you make another layout in a sub route, basically it takes the content of that layout and it like puts it inside somewhere inside of this layout. And then if you have another sub route down here, so like let's say this is like a random page.tsx of, we'll say ID of page.tsx. What this is going to do again is it's going to take this content and it's going to nest it somewhere in the layout that's above. So it kind of like goes up the directory tree and keeps looking for layouts. And it takes this content and it puts it in the first child that it finds. So in this case, it's going to take the page content and it's going to put it here. And then it takes this whole thing, it goes up another step in the parent directory, it finds a layout, and it's going to put that content there. So maybe it's super easy. Maybe you guys understand that. Maybe you're a beginner and that's kind of confusing to you. But that's kind of how layouts work. But it gives you the flexibility of here you can define like a top navigation. And then here you can do like a side navigation that only exists on /dashboard routes. And then over here, you can change what the content is for every nested panel of your dashboard. Like let's say you had like an overview or an analytics endpoint. This would basically take your analytics charts and put them in this black square here. Okay, so that's kind of how layouts work. We talked about how routing works. We talked about how the params and search parameters work. Let's talk about React server components because I think these are really cool to understand. So when your page loads, by default now, Next gives you the ability to use like async await inside of your components if you're using a React server component. For example, this page right here, this would be a React server component. The layout, this would be like a React server component. You could just add async here and you can actually do some type of data fetching directly there. So I'm trying to think of a good example of what we can do here. Maybe what we could do is in this layout, the side navigation layout, maybe we could make this a React server component and we can fetch some Pokemon data and show those in the side navigation. Does that sound cool? So let's go to the Pokemon API and let's just copy this. So before, as you know, you had to use like get server-side props. You had to do your data fetching there, and then you had to pass that or return that, and those would get sent in as props to your page. Now you can do data fetching in any component that you want. And by default, everything is like a React server component unless you add use client to the top. So let's try to fetch some of this data. I'm just going to say const like Pokemon data is equal to fetch. And we're going to make a fetch request to this endpoint. I believe we can just do this endpoint, hopefully. And since this is an async keyword here, we can just do an await. I'll do a response here, and I'll say Pokemon data is equal to Pokemon data response of JSON. That. Make sure you do an await, and I can just go ahead and console log this of Pokemon data. So now when we try to hit that nested route, notice that it just did a request. It got the Pokemon data and it's printing it out to my console here. Pretty awesome. And if we wanted to kind of just loop over the results and render them to the page, we can do that. So I'm going to say like const Pokemon is equal to Pokemon data.results. Or if you want to be fancy, you could just do this. Pokemon. That's a little cleaner, I guess. So let's take the Pokemon and let's just go ahead and like map over this. Just say poke. And then we will just render out an li, and we'll say poke dot. Hopefully name was something. I kind of deleted it, so I don't even know at this point. And then we could just do a key. So I'll say poke dot name. All right, let's check this out. So now we have a bunch of Pokemon that are actually displaying to the left here. And if we were to, let's just increase this to 36, how about that? You can see all these Pokemon being rendered out. So the takeaway there is that we didn't have to use like an effect to fetch some data from a remote API. All this code runs when the browser makes the initial request to your server. The server kind of runs through your tree of React components, and it starts running these and loading them and rendering them. And then it sends you like an initial snapshot of like the HTML. But let's say we want to like fetch individual Pokemon when the user clicks on one of these things. Okay, well, what we could do here is in this nested page, I'm actually going to rename this to Pokemon since we actually have like a theme of this video. And if you were to go to a particular ID of a Pokemon, we want to fetch that Pokemon and display it. So let's go here. I'm going to go ahead and just go like this. We're going to make another React server component called Pokemon, and that is going to take in the params here. So let's go ahead and delete this, and I'll say params. And we're going to use the params that came in to fetch a Pokemon based on their ID. Okay, so let's just go ahead and do some interpolation here with the string here, and I will say Pokemon of params.id. All right, so hopefully this works. Let's just go ahead and print out Pokemon to make sure we're on the right path. And then we're just going to render out, I don't know, we'll just say JSON stringify it so we can see it on the page. Okay, so let's go over here and let's go to Pokemon and let's type in 1 and see what happens. Now, I don't know if it needs to be 1 or if it needs to be the actual name. I think it actually needs to be the name, like Ditto. So if we go over here and type in Ditto, we get nothing. So the console is getting printed out, like this is doing a request to this endpoint. Okay, I think the issue is because I'm doing like results here. I think the data that comes back, if you look at the API, like this is what it looks like. So we need to actually just get like the name. Where does the name come from? Actually, technically we don't need to do anything. Let's just do this. We'll say results like this, and we're gonna take those results. We're gonna render those straight to the page like this. Okay, so let's go back to our app. Now we got all of that Pokemon data displayed. Probably not a good idea now that I think about it. Is there a name? There is. We can just do name. Okay, so let's just grab the name here. And we're going to go ahead and just print out the name. Okay, so does that make sense? So like we have a bunch of different nested layouts, and those layouts load in more stuff, and those run more React server components that fetch more data. Now I did want to kind of figure out like what happens if for whatever reason there's a delay when you're like loading in this data. All right, just for the sake of it, just for like science, let's just go ahead and like do a quick little await here. So I'll say await new promise, resolve, set timeout, resolve, and then I'll just say 2 seconds. So if we were to make this side navigation layout wait 2 seconds before it finishes, what actually happens? Okay, so the page actually takes about 2 seconds before it finishes loading. Not the best user experience, right? So another really cool thing that you can do with React server components is you can take things that take a while to load and you can like pull them out into other components. So technically, the only thing that needs to care about Pokemon would be this aside. So I could just go ahead and make another component here. I could say like function Pokemon list, and I'm going to return that thing there. And I can just go ahead and grab out this all this logic. I'll go ahead and pull all that out. I'll make sure I put async here because that's kind of important. And we're going to basically use this Pokemon list. It's now its own little isolated React server component. I'm going to render that out here. And I'm actually going to wrap this in a suspense like this. I'll give it a fallback and I'll say like loading all Pokemon dot 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 like this. Now, I need to update my TypeScript version, but there is an error with TypeScript and React. Unless you get to a specific version, this will always complain, which kind of sucks. But this just works like a normal component. You could pass in props and use those props. But the benefit is now this thing won't block for 2 seconds. Your page will just load, and you'll see on the left, loading all Pokemon will like start loading. But then the Ditto stuff will actually render out. Okay, I kind of wish I kept the... I don't want to keep the aside there. Let me just do this. Okay, I think that'll be a better user experience. So what this is doing is React basically like is going to stream in this data as it gets loaded and finishes, right? And then it's going to continue to render out the children, which again is just another tree of React server components. So this is going to do this logic over here. You could add it your own timeout, but it kind of gives you the flexibility. Like I really like the app directory now. Like the server components gives you the flexibility to kind of pull stuff apart and optimize performance in different areas as you need to. It can be a little bit daunting and hard to understand at first, but it actually is quite powerful once you get a hang of it. So we talked about layouts. We talked about like React server components. We talked about like parameters and query string parameters. We talked about different page routes. One thing that's really important to kind of cover would be like client components. Like, cool, we have all this data that's rendered on the server and like just displayed, but unfortunately you can't even use like use effects here. Like if you actually try to add like a use effect, this thing just crashes. Like, let me show you. If I were to try to import this and save it, the entire app just doesn't work because you're not allowed to use state, can't use effect. There's other things you cannot use in React server components. And again, this is a React server component because it has like async in front of it, okay? So if you can't use like certain things, like how do you actually do things when people click on buttons and whatnot? The best solution I have found, like for example, let's say you wanted to have something on one page change something in another component, you'd still do the same approach like you normally do with React, right? So in our case, we could like install Jotai. I'll just say like install npm install Jotai. Okay, this is going to be a super convoluted example, but hopefully it kind of like helps you understand a little bit better. Let's refactor this a little bit. So let's say we had like a client page here, and we could have like a use client. Okay, you need to put this use client string at the top of the file so that Next in React knows that this is a client component. And when you do that, you can just go ahead and like export, I don't know, Pokemon, Pokédex. Let's just say Pokédex. And then instead of rendering this out, we're actually going to render out the Pokédex right here. So I'll just go ahead and do this. Okay. So now what we're doing is we're saying, hey, inside this React server component, load in this client component and display it. And what we can actually do is we can send in Pokemon data like this. I could just go ahead and say like Pokemon is equal to Pokemon data. Okay. And now we have like the server fetches the data, it has the data, and it passes it in to a client component, just doing the normal approach with props. So if I were to just go ahead and say like Pokemon, and that's, I'm just going to say any for right now because I'm lazy and I don't have the types. But now we can actually use the prop that was passed in to display the name and display whatever else inside this client component. And we can actually start adding traditional React stuff like state or forms or, you know, on-click listeners. For example, if I were to make this a button like this, so it's a button that has a name on it. It's not styled, so maybe we should style it so like this example's not terrible. Let's just give this just give it a background in blue, padding of 2 or something. And maybe get rid of the flex there. Okay. All right, so there is our ugly button. It doesn't even change color when you hover it. But the idea, what I'm trying to show, is that inside your client components, you can actually start writing your normal React code. So if you wanted to add like an on click and you wanted to do something, so I'll just go ahead and say like a console log here. Just say like hello, and I'll just go ahead and do this. Okay, so now we can actually click on this thing. Okay, and it prints out hello. But again, like, why do we just install Jotai? Well, I wanted to show an example of, like, let's say you wanted to share state between components. Well, let's say when you click on this, I want to render out something up here in the very top of the page. I want to do some dynamic data changing. You can still kind of share state by basically just importing Jotai or whatever state management library you want to use. You could use context. I just like Jotai a lot because it's really easy. And let's go to like the navigation, which I believe is in this layout. Technically what I could do is I could basically just create a header here, right? So if I wanted to make a nav bar, okay? Again, we're going to have to make a client component. I'll say navbar.tsx, and I'll say use client. And then I'm going to say export function navbar, and then I'm going to return that thing, okay? Now, the main reason I'm doing this is, let's say you wanted to be able to have one client component modify the navbar dynamically. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and import Jotai from Jotai. Okay, and then I'm going to go ahead and say like export name atom equals, I think it's just create atom. Is that how you do it? Maybe I need to do this. I need to go to the docs and probably make sure I know what I'm doing. Let's see, atom. Looks like this. Okay, I forgot the syntax for it. So if I just make an atom with like an empty string, what we could do is we can actually say const name set name equals use atom. I know I'm kind of like jumping around, and I think I just kind of got really distracted, but this is something I just kind of ran into on my own personal project, and I think it's really important to kind of help drive some points home that React still works the same way like as normal under the hood. So we got some atom here. I'm going to go ahead and just render out name. Okay, and now what I want to do is I'm going to do the same thing inside of my client component that was in like a deeply nested route. I'm going to go ahead and pull that in. I'm going to pull in set name here. I want to make sure I auto import these things from my other components. And now when I click on this thing, I could say set name, and I could just say Pokemon.name. All right, so if I did this right, what should happen is I click on Ditto, and you should see Ditto pop up somewhere in the header. And it would if I actually imported the nav bar. So I forgot to import the nav bar. Let's try it again. All right, what am I doing wrong? All right, so obviously I think I might have a little bug. Let me make sure I'm getting here. When you click on this button, I want to make sure a console log prints out. Okay, it does. And Pokemon.name, is that set? I did see it show up in the top nav. Okay, Ditto did show up. Let me do a hard refresh and click it again. I don't know why that wasn't showing it before, but now it's working. So the whole point of that is React still works the way React should. You can still share state. If you have stuff in a client component, like by using use client, you can still have some external state management, or you can use context and like share that with a provider, and you can just do things the normal React way. The React server component things just really help us write cleaner code, in my opinion, because now we don't have to like write use effects everywhere, right? Before, if you had a component load, you had to have a use effect that had to fetch some data. Then you had to return a cleanup function, all this other stuff. Now you can just fetch the data when the route loads, pass it in as props, and you can render that out to the page. Now there's also a bunch of other stuff I haven't talked about. Like there's ways that you can use server actions to basically like upload some data and then like invalidate the entire path. Then React will traverse your whole tree and like recompute everything. So let's just try it. Let's just pretend like there's an action here. Like when you click the button, let's just make an actions CSX, and we're going to go ahead and say use server, and we're going to say export function do stuff. Okay. And technically we could have like a collection of names here, which is an array. And when you call this asynchronous do stuff, we're just going to say names.push, and we're going to push in like a new name that says hello world. Okay. And the second thing we're going to do is we're going to say revalidate path, and we're going to go ahead and just say Pokemon. I think this should hopefully work. So what this is doing is basically the directory, it's going to revalidate and rerun all of the React server components and recompute everything so that your page can like reload. The idea is the server action is a function that you can invoke from your front end, right? It's like back-end logic that runs from your front end. So if you wanted to run that when you click on this, what you can actually do is you can set up a transition. I'll just change this to is loading. So the idea is you can actually call this start transition, and I can call a server action. So in this case, I can call my action of do stuff here like that, and make sure I import this. And I think if I did this all correct, what should happen is it should just push another name into this array. And then since it revalidates this Pokemon path, this layout will rerun, and that'll get new values for names here. Hopefully, if I'm thinking about this right, and then it should render out the name here. So let's just go to our page. And before you can do that, you have to turn on the experimental server action. So let's go to the next config. I'm gonna say experimental, and I'll say server actions is true. So we can actually like kind of do this experimental feature. I'm really psyched about the experimental server actions. Like I hope they get out of alpha soon and more like stable, because I think it can potentially help you reduce a lot of the code that you write. Let's just go ahead and refresh this real quick. The use server file can only export async functions. Use server async. Okay, it's because I did this. Export async get names. I don't even know if this is gonna work, to be honest. Okay, so instead of like exporting the actual constant, which I guess React was not happy about, we are going to call get names here and auto import that from actions. And hopefully that makes it happy. And again, since this is async now, we actually need to say like await on this. At this point, this is just becoming a mess. But I wanted to kind of like just show the point. I wanted to drive the point home and hopefully help someone learn more about what's going on with all this stuff. So now if I click on this, what should happen is it should invoke that backend server action. You know, now that I think about this example I was going to show you is not that great, but basically what happens here is like from the front end, you can run a server action, and that server action is going to basically like insert data into a database. And then you'd revalidate the actual like path in your next app directory structure. And then next is basically going to rerun that whole tree, recompute the things, and like rerun all the asynchronous processes to fetch fresh data from the database and recompute what everything needs to be displayed. All right, that's all I wanted to show in this video. I kind of didn't really plan that well for this video. I jumped around, but I hope there's something that I talked about in this video that helps you understand the app router just a little bit better. And if I did, leave a comment, let me know. If you feel like this video is just all over the place, leave a comment, let me know. And like always, I have a Discord channel you're welcome to join if you want to find a place to talk to some other developers or get help. I also hang out there once in a while. Other than that, have a good day and happy coding.